Hello. Today we're going to start talking about So when we talk about artwork that's on a flat surface, we usually call that the picture plane, no matter if it's a canvas or drawing paper. But the picture plane refers to that two-dimensional plane in which the artist will work. These are all the visual elements on your test for this over this content. You will be shown different images and you'll have to choose which element that we talked about with that work of art. So again, I'm not asking you to memorize names and titles. I'm just asking you to remember which element that we talked about being that stood out with their work. So most of these words you probably already know them because they're words that we use in our daily vocabulary outside of talking about art, just talking about anything visual around us, and most of them mean the same thing. However, with artwork, when we look closer and try to analyze the elements and the principles of design, that sometimes can help us understand the art more and see all the expressive possibilities that are present. And so it's good to look at each element separately and see what it does within that work of art. This slide just kind of says that some artwork may have more elements than others, and so not every work of art has color necessarily. Not every work of art has lines, um, but some, these elements stand out more so than others. So, for an example, when you have to go to the museum and to a gallery for those two writing assignments, it will ask you like which elements stand out to you. You don't have to list all of them, but just the ones that really stood out. All right, so we've all probably heard of different definitions of line in your other classes. So these are a few of those. But with artwork, you need to realize that line is very, very important. It can mean a lot of different things, and it can make you see things that maybe aren't even there sometimes. So lines can have a lot of characteristics. Think about people's handwriting, and you've all probably read people's handwritten notes before, and maybe you could decide. Sorry, that's my dogs. Maybe you could decide like what kind of personality traits that they have based upon their handwriting. There's actually studies based upon personality characteristics and handwriting. Lines can also do several things at once, and they can indicate direction, like we see on maps. But in artwork, they can create what we call directional forces, which are pathways for our eyes to follow. They also help us identify shapes and spaces and many other things that you can see listed here. These are a couple of different types of lines. Most of these things you probably are familiar with already, but some little fun facts. Implied lines are dotted lines or lines that we don't actually see, but our mind creates the line. Not only is this dotted lines and like dashes, but it also could be in a composition if you have, let's say, multiple figures or people in a painting. Sometimes in a painting or in a photograph, you'll see those people looking at each other and it makes you look at each of them. And so that also is a type of implied line. Also, vertical lines tend to make you feel more attentive because we feel more attentive when we're standing up, where horizontal lines tend to make us feel more relaxed and at ease because we feel more relaxed usually when we're laying down. And diagonal lines have the most energy out of all the different types of lines. So, like I said, lines are very important in art, and we can see them. You do several different functions. Here's some examples of what we call cross contour lines. And in a drawing class, you would learn how to do this, but it's where you draw lines that suggest the volume or mass of the object. Now, again, you don't need to know these artists' names. It wouldn't hurt you if you memorize those two just for your own sake. But these are all artists that use line a lot in their work, but they use line in a different way. And so I'm going to go through and show you some of their work, and hopefully you'll see the presence of line and the expressive possibilities of line standing out. You'll also hopefully be able to recognize that for the test. So don't make it harder than it is. All right. So first we have Alexander Calder. He's a very interesting character. He worked mostly with wire and made sculptures. And he eventually was the person that invented the mobile, the thing that spins around a baby's crib, but also he made big, huge ones that would spin around in a museum. So here we see some of Alexander Calder's sculptures that were made out of just wire. And you can see the wire, uh, it works as just an outline for the different subject matter that he chose to depict. And so very simple. Bridget Riley, she's still alive and working. She created a movement called op art, which stands for optical art. So this artwork has so many repeating lines, it actually makes your eye see something that's not there and creates an optical illusion. And so she was one of the first artists that started making optical illusions with just black paint on paper or canvas. And a lot of her works, they're really large, so you have to see them in person to really get the full effect. But so when we go through these, you can kind of see how line being repeated over and over can create this sense of optical illusion. And you could do this easily with like a black Sharpie marker and a piece of paper. So it just shows you how powerful lines can be and how they can make us sometimes see things that aren't even there. I usually can't stand looking at her stuff for very long because it kind of makes my eyes hurt and I get a migraine. But you can see all of these, they're just different types of lines that are repeated over and over and over. And sometimes it even looks like they're moving, but they're not. It's just simple lines. So you can go through and see several of these. This one's really hard to look at because she added some color lines in it too, and it will kind of give you a headache if you stare at it too long. So a lot of that artwork from that op art period, some people still make op art. That's what inspired a lot of the optical illusion books and things that we have today. And this is just a link if you want to see some fun optical illusions, but there's nothing there that you need to know for the test. Now, Jean-Michel Basquiat, he was another artist that used primarily line, but in a very expressive way. He's also known for dating Madonna, the singer and dancer. And before she was really famous, he became really good friends with Andy Warhol and had a really big career. He was able to get recognized in his early 20s and got a lot of recognition. Sadly, after Andy Warhol passed away, he went into a kind of depression and he struggled with drug addiction. And that ultimately, that's what killed him at only 28 years old. He died of a heroin overdose. So it's always sad to see artists that go that direction because they don't get to really reap the benefits of their success. Nowadays, his artwork sells for millions of dollars. You see it on T-shirts and sorry about that. You also see a lot of graffiti artists. They pay tribute to him by putting like a crown symbol on a lot of their graffiti. So these are some of his pieces here, and you can see it's basically just a bunch of scribbling lines. And although this looks really messy, it's very expressive. It's kind of like when we see children work, and their artwork is very powerful and meaningful. That's kind of what he did. He worked in a very stream of consciousness way of mark making, and he just layered lines and lines, and also used text. A lot of people forget that text is based upon line and it is part of our communication. So he would often put words and symbols and things like that in his work as well. And we can see some more of his imagery here, but just very expressive stuff. And most of the figures and things are just made up of very expressive lines. Now, you'll watch a video for one of your homework assignments about Keith Haring, and hopefully you'll enjoy that. And he also was a graffiti artist that made it really big and was also around the same time as Basquiat, and he was also friends with Madonna and Warhol and Michael Jackson and a bunch of people. You'll probably enjoy the video quite a bit about his life, and you'll recognize his work because it's also in the mainstream media still. You can find T-shirts and all kinds of things. The brand Lacoste actually just recently launched a new line of clothing paying tribute to him as well. So I think you'll enjoy the video about him. Now, shape as an element is pretty simple. You all know shapes are. You've probably had to learn about them since you were in grade school. There are two main categories, geometric and organic, and you can see the examples here of what those are. We can also talk about in terms of composition, um, the shapes being positive or negative. The positive shapes would be the figures or subjects that stand out, where the negative would be the background. Now, sometimes in art, we can't determine what is um, what's the subject matter, because maybe there's not always subject matter, or maybe the background has interesting things as well. So whenever you can't tell like what's the positive shape or the negative shape, we call that figure ground reversal. So these are some artists that their work has a strong use of shape within it. Matisse used a lot of organic shapes depicting abstract forms of the human body. Mondrian, who we talked about in the first unit, he used often geometric shapes like rectangles and squares. And M.C. Escher, he was known for creating figure ground reversal in a lot of his printmaking. So here are some of Matisse's pieces. You probably recognize Matisse's work because he is very famous. And what a lot of people don't know is that he was one of the first artists to use cut paper as collage. He mostly liked to paint, but he was really ill at one point in his life and he had to work from bed and he couldn't really paint. So he would cut out shapes of colored paper and have his assistant glue them onto a larger surface. This is Mondrian's work we talked about before when we talked about non-objective work, and this he mostly worked with rectangles and squares. And then this is some of M.C. Escher's work. Believe it or not, this is a print. So what that means is we'll talk about printmaking later this semester, but it's a process where you have a piece of wood or metal or linoleum, and you carve or etch into it, creating an image, and then you apply ink to it or inside of the grooves, depending on the process, and then you put paper on it and you print it like a stamp. And so these are the prints from those things that he made. And it's pretty amazing how he was able to do all of this. Now, at first glance, you may be like, well, how is this figure ground reversal? But if you notice, the white birds become the negative shapes between the blackbirds, and the blackbirds become the negative shapes between the white birds, and then the birds slowly metamorphosize and turn into the plots of land below. So it is an example of figure ground reversal, and that's what I admire about his work mostly is that he was able to make things so complex look very simple. Here we can see Sky and Water. This is a piece that he did using birds and fish, and this was a woodcut, so he carved this into a piece of wood, and he would have had to carve away all the white area, and then he would ink it up with a roller and then apply paper on top and print it. But you can see the birds become the negative shapes between the fish, and the fish become the negative shapes between the birds. And this is a huge one he did. It's over 25 feet long. And there's a link to his website if you wanted to see more of his work. His work is really beautiful. And I know several of you were not sure of your major when I read your first assignment. And he was one that his parents wanted him to be an architect. But when he went to school, his professors convinced him to be a fine arts major and major in printmaking. So he was one of those ones that kind of a different type of art discovered him. Now, mass as a visual element, it's a little bit harder to understand. I know in most of your other classes, mass probably it means like weight or the bulk of something, and it basically means the same thing in art. Mass is kind of like the word that describes the shape of three-dimensional objects mostly. However, it can be present in two-dimensional art as well. We use it to describe kind of a heaviness that's present. Now, with mass, we don't really have a positive and negative mass. We call it closed form and open form. Closed form is where things are solid object with not really interacting in the space around it, where open form would mean that it's open and interacts with the environment more. So think about like architecture. Things that are closed form would be like maybe a solid rectangular building, where like an open form maybe is like a castle that has like a bunch of towers and things that it kind of opens up to the environment. These are some more examples. A lot of Egyptian art is all closed form. It's these very solid, bulky items. Also, their architecture was as well for ancient Egyptians. Some people have different theories about why they did this, but most historians believe that this was done because they believed that in your afterlife, you could take your items with you. And so they wanted to make things that would last a really long time. And they knew that if they made objects that had small arms that were just kind of disconnected from the body, that they might be broken as time goes on. So that's why we believe they did it, and obviously they have lasted a very long time. Alberto Giacometti, he is also an artist that worked with sculpture, and he made these forms that you can see look very open, kind of even fragile looking. Most of them have been cast in bronze, so they are pretty sturdy. But he had an idea that every day that we lived, we're slowly decomposing. It's kind of a depressing way to think of things, but he had a very negative outlook towards life because he had lost loved ones at a very young age. And so he would just make these figures and keep picking at them until almost nothing was left at all. He actually once said that none of his artwork was finished unless it wasn't there anymore. And so he made very open form pieces. Now, this is a two-dimensional piece of art. This is a print, a linoleum print by Elizabeth Catlett. And although it's flat, it doesn't necessarily have physical mass, but because of her use of value and line, it makes the figure feel really heavy. So by using some of the other elements, sometimes two-dimensional art can have a sense of mass or bulkiness as well. We can see the same effect taking place in Diego Rivera's work. He's a famous Mexican artist. He was actually the first Mexican artist to have a solo exhibit in the United States, and it was at the Modern Museum of Art in New York City. And in this painting, we talked about Frida Kahlo last week, and he was married to Frida Kahlo. He's the one that helped her become successful as well. But a lot of people know his work because he makes everything kind of rounded and by using modeling. And even though this is a painting, it looks very three-dimensional and it feels really heavy, even though it's a man carrying flowers. By everything touching kind of the edge of the canvas, it makes it feel more bulky or like it has mass. Now, space is a word that is very complex. And you'll do a daily assignment where you'll tell me about some of your favorite spaces. So space can be determined by pretty much anything around us or that we're within or even within our own bodies. So really the best definition for space is the general receptacle of all things. It's kind of indefinable, if you will. Now, some art actually takes up space, and that's some of the things like painting, sculpture, drawing, those sorts of things, where other types of art are temporal, and that means that they last just a moment. They're not necessarily something that you can touch once the time has moved on. And this could be things like dance, theater, music, those sorts of things. But also, we saw the sand mandalas that were made last week, and that would also be an example of a temporal form of art. Drawing on the sidewalk would be an example of temporal art because it's not going to last for a long time. Now, in architecture, space is very important because the architect's working with exterior space and interior space. And also in movie making and videos, space is very important. We all have probably stepped back in our seats at a movie theater because Batman jumped off a building or something like that. So we're really influenced by space that's created in movies and also in architecture. Now, some people may question, well, is architecture really art? It really kind of depends on the architect. There are some architects that make buildings just to serve a function, but then there are others that try to create an experience for the person inhabiting their spaces. And I think those ones would be more of like an artist. This architect that designed this airport in this image, he thought about the person traveling, and he thought, well, they're either getting on or off an airplane, a very small confided space. And so he decided, well, I'm going to make it feel really open and airy inside of the airport. So he made one wall, nothing but glass windows, but then also made this exaggerated ceiling so that it felt very open. And so it was a nice break for the traveler that would be going through the airport. Interior designers also have to deal with space and working with their client to make sure that their needs and um, functionality are met. But in a way, I think we all are kind of interior designers because we all decorate our homes to look and feel how we want them to be. Now, in artwork that's flat, like drawings and paintings, we can only create depth through implying it or create space through implying it. And for a long time, we did not have the best ways to do that. So if you look at some of the art before the Renaissance, you'll see overlapping, things getting smaller as they get closer to the top of the paper or further away from our eye. And then sometimes we would put things closer to the bottom of the paper to read as being closer to us. And so you can see an example of that here. And in artwork before the Renaissance, you'll see some subtle suggestions like overlapping and vertical placement and things like that. However, it wasn't very accurately done. And if you think back to that Merode altarpiece that I showed you with Mary and the angel, the table and stuff look kind of weird, and that's because this was not the best way to create space. However, during the Renaissance, which means rebirth, artists started studying math and science and other things as well, and that led them to discover a type of way of creating space that we now call linear perspective. And linear perspective is based upon the idea that everything goes towards a point or points in space. And they determine where that point is and where that it falls when you look into the distance. And they started calling that point the vanishing point, and where the vanishing point always lies is what we call the horizon line, which is where the earth and the sky meet. And then the vantage point, that's where the viewer is looking into the space. And so once they figured this out, it really changed the world. And like I said, this was in the Renaissance, so the 15 and 1600s, and this was before the photograph existed. So once artists knew how to do perspective, it really allowed them to make things that looked real, more real than real life, and before they even had a photograph. So you can imagine this really changed the lives of a lot of artists. Some artists even supposedly never made art again. Once they discovered perspective, all they wanted to do was draw perspective drawings. That's actually was written about in the first art history book, that they would stay up all night finding vanishing points. So this was kind of like the invention of the internet for people back then. So on the test, you're going to be shown different types of perspective, and you're going to have to guess which type of perspective it is. Hopefully not guess, hopefully you'll know it. And so we're going to go through 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective, atmospheric perspective, and isometric perspective. And they should be really easy to understand the difference between them. So with 1-point perspective, you'll see that all the objects are drawn to one vanishing point. So the one refers to the number of points that there are. So you can see right in the middle, you'll see the vanishing point. And notice that the boxes that we look at, we're looking at them from a flat side. And so we draw from those corners of those boxes to that vanishing point, and it makes it look like they all converge in that one point. Now I know I just told you that perspective was developed in the Renaissance, and this is a Renaissance artist named Raphael. And a lot of you probably have heard of Raphael because of the Ninja Turtle cartoon. And the other Ninja Turtles were Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Donatello. And those were all artists during the Renaissance as well. However, they weren't all buddies, and they all didn't hang out in a sewer and eat pizza with a big rat. They actually were each other's competition. And so, in the order of age, it was Donatello, then Leonardo da Vinci, then Michelangelo, and then Raphael. He was the youngest of these famous artists that we know of from Europe in the Renaissance. Now, they, like I said, they were each other's competition. So Raphael was seen as a new threat, and so a lot of them, they didn't get along. They would kind of argue with each other. But Raphael, being the youngest, and without them having the college system like we have today, they had to learn from each other. So even though Raphael didn't really wasn't best buds with them, he still admired them greatly. And so in this painting, it's supposed to represent the school of Athens or philosophy as a subject matter. And this was one of four paintings that he did in the Pope's library on the wall. So there were four murals that he got to paint, and this is one of them. And the four murals were supposed to represent the four branches of knowledge. And people back then would have recognized this because in the center, we see Plato with his hand in the air, motioning towards the sky because his theories were based upon studying earthly forms. And then right next to him is Aristotle, and his hands motioning towards the ground because his theories were based upon studying earthly forms. So you have this dichotomy of philosophy right in the center of this painting. And if you follow the lines of the architecture that he painted, it also makes the vanishing point right between them. So it's amazing that this was newly created, and then Raphael mastered this. And not only that, he painted it on a wall, on a huge wall, in a technique called fresco painting, where he had to put down wet plaster and pigment before it would dry. So, how he did that, I have no idea. But this is what learning is. You're supposed to be taught something and then do it yourself. And I know that doesn't always work that way when I teach drawing and painting, so it takes them a couple of times. But Raphael, that's why we call him a master. Now, to show you how he paid tribute to those artists that he studied after, they say that Plato looks like Leonardo da Vinci. And then this man sitting closer to us with his elbow on this box, like he's coloring by himself, that's supposedly Michelangelo because he was known for being kind of stubborn and not working well with other people. And then way on the far right side of the image, you'll see kind of a profile of a face, and that is supposedly a selfie of Raphael. So this is supposed to represent all these great philosophers and thinkers, but just to be kind of add a contemporary touch to it, he threw in some of his colleagues that he respected. Now on this slide, you can see I've lightened the image in Photoshop and then applied the orthogonals, which are the imaginary lines that go back in space, and you can see how precise and perfect the perspective is. Here we see, I wanted to show you another image that had 1 point perspective. Notice on this one, if you follow the lines of the table, it leads you to a vanishing point that's up in the upper right hand corner. And one thing during the Renaissance they didn't realize is that the vanishing point doesn't always have to be in the center of the paper. And so in the era that followed the Renaissance, which we call the Baroque era, they started moving the vanishing point around, and it made for more dynamic compositions. Notice also it looks like someone turned the lights off. And one of the other characteristics of Baroque art is that it's much more dramatic. Now, 2 point perspective, the word two is in that because there's two vanishing points. And so we can see that there's two vanishing points on the horizon line in this diagram. And the boxes, we're seeing them from a corner or an edge. And this is always how you draw 2 point perspective, because 2 point perspective is when you're looking at it from a corner. So think about if you were looking at a table from a corner, you would see the sides go off in two directions. And so we don't always get to look at stuff face on like we do with 1 point perspective. So anytime you see something from a corner, you have to draw to two vanishing points. And so we can see here is an example of 2 point perspective in a painting by Vincent van Gogh. And although Van Gogh's work was abstract because of his color use and his really thick use of paint and a technique we call impasto, his perspective is spot on. If we were to follow the sides of this house, on both sides we would have two vanishing points in either direction. Now, Edward Hopper, he also was a famous painter. And this house, it's very complex, but if you follow all the lines, it's actually in 2 point perspective as well. Now, there is a 3 point perspective and a 5 point perspective, but I'm not going to make you memorize those for the test. But if you're curious about it, 3 point perspective is where there's a vanishing point in the sky or way below on the ground. And so that would be used if you're drawing something really tall, like a skyscraper, because it's going to be so tall, it's also going to appear to go to a point in the sky as well. or if you're standing on top of it looking down, it will appear to do that. And we call those bird's eye view or worm's eye view. And then 5 point perspective is where it makes you draw to both sides, to the top and bottom, and then also to the distance furthest away from you. And that makes you see things kind of like a fisheye view. But if you Google those, you'll find more examples of those. So, but I just want you to know 1 point, 2 point, and then atmospheric perspective. It does not involve any lines. It actually has to do well. So here's some examples of atmospheric perspective as seen in a photograph of a mountain range. This really beautiful landscape painting. Notice the objects closest to us are very sharp and crisp and rich in color, where the things that are further away, they get very tinted and they get kind of blurry. And so these are just more examples of atmospheric perspective. Even the Mona Lisa, one of the most famous paintings in the world, that's at the Louvre in Paris, it's got perfect atmospheric perspective in the background. All right, and then the last type of perspective you need to know is isometric perspective. An isometric perspective is where you draw parallel lines parallel. So you don't use any type of 1 point or 2 point. You draw things as they actually are. And so this usually makes it not look very realistic because we're not drawing as we see it, we're drawing it as it actually is. And that's going to make it easier to understand for other people if you're going to be building something. So a lot of construction workers and engineers and architects, they use this type of perspective so that if anybody has to build their designs, they keep things accurate. Now, some cultures throughout history also believed you shouldn't distort things, and so there were a couple of dynasties in Asia wherever you weren't allowed to distort things. So in this drawing here, or this painting, you can see that the lines are parallel for the furniture. However, everything else looks pretty realistic. And then for value and light as an element, that is a important element to learn about because it helps us learn to see things in a more three-dimensional view, but also it lets us see things, the color of things, and different things like that. So really, light is what allows us to see. Light is also not clear or white. It's actually made up of all the colors, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the lecture over color, which will be coming up. Light can also have an effect on us, and we'll talk more about that. But people, tend to get sleepier when it's dark. In parts of the world where it's dark for long periods of time, there's usually higher depression and things like that. And so, light and artwork can also trigger things in people and make them feel a certain way. Light can also affect how we see things. So you may be walking one day and see a little deer, and it probably, unless you have some fear of deer, it's probably not that scary. You probably would think it's cute. But let's say you were walking at night and you saw the image on the right, which was kind of look like a silhouette of a deer, but you may also think it could be the chupacabra or something like that because, without all the details, it kind of makes it more mysterious or possibly scary. So artists have to understand light when making their work if they want to express things the way that they intend to. And one example is when the Lincoln Memorial was created, the artist that sculpted the statue of Lincoln, he wanted it to use natural light, but at certain times of the day, the image would look like the part on the left, which didn't make him look like the strong leader that he wanted him to be. And so they had to install artificial lights overhead so that you would get that nice cast shadow from his eyebrows onto his face. Now, when we talk about light and shadow, we refer to that as the word value. And value refers to the different light and shadows or darkness in imagery and things that we see or draw. And that's really important to learn. And as an artist, in a lot of classes like painting or drawing, design, you'll have to do projects that deal with value because that's one of the hardest things for people to learn to communicate. but it's very important. You can look at this value scale on the screen now, and the inside rectangle, it appears to be lighter on the left and darker on the right, but it's actually all the same neutral gray. But because the outer rectangle fades from black and gradates to white, it makes the inner rectangle appear to change. And so the reason that I'm showing you this is if you're learning to shade or paint different values and you don't get them quite right, it's going to look really off. Whenever artists are able to create a subtle gradation where you don't really see any lines at all, we call that chiaroscuro, which is an Italian word that literally means light and darkness. But we use that word to describe artwork that's got a really subtle shading and where you don't see harsh lines. And so that's what most artists want to get to, where their artwork is like that as well. And so this is a diagram showing the different lights and points of shadow. And in drawing or painting class, you would learn more about this and how to notice these in a still life that you're drawing or on a model if you have a model. These are some examples of those value studies that you would have to do in a drawing class, and that's what helps you get better at shading. Now, some artists, they don't need color in their work. They may not necessarily want it. And so one artist, when I hear value, the one artist that comes to mind is Käthe Kollwitz, and she was a German printmaker that lived through both World War I and World War II. And she rarely used color because she said that color had been taken from her. She lost a child in World War I and grandchildren in World War II. And so a lot of her work was about being a woman during these horrible times, and also being a mother and not being able to control the fate of her children. And so by not adding color, it makes it feel kind of more depressing and sad. And that's the message that she was trying to convey to the viewer. She was one of the first artists that, when I saw her work when I was in high school, it made me feel that kind of sick feeling inside, like when you see something really sad. And I'd never had visual art really make me have that feeling before. So I've always kind of been drawn to her stuff because you really feel the sadness and pain in her work. Now, value can also be seen in artwork by being made by actual lights. And so there are some sculptors that use light bulbs to make their work. And this is one artist that used fluorescent lights to make different installations with his work. So these are actual lights in a gallery or museum. And then Bruce Newman, he was an artist that used neon lights as his medium, and he would have them say different, kind of like visual poetry, if you will, and imagery, and he would use those neon lights. So again, these are actual lights on the wall. And then lastly, some of you probably have been to a big arena concert before where there's thousands of people, and a lot of musicians have light shows that accompany their musics and videos and things like that. And there are people, they're actually called lighting artists, that create choreographed light shows to go with musicians' songs. And it makes a more sensational experience for the viewer when they attend these large arena concerts. And this is some work by Brian Hartley. He works a lot with rock bands, and these are some images from a concert he choreographed for Lenny Kravitz and Nine Inch Nails here. So the light is also the medium here, and it creates an experience for the viewer that's also there to listen to the music. So this concludes half of the visual elements, and then you'll find color through time and motion in the next PowerPoint.